So Aaron and I he started a year after me. And one of the things that is entertaining for me, thinking back, is that I was teaching online instruction, and I was like, I'm doing pretty good. You know, students' expectations were somewhat varied. And then Aaron came in, and he challenged my perception of what good instruction looked like. And so I had a lot of rich opportunities to discuss pedagogy. You know, he had a lot of insight, and as recent graduates, having a sense of kind of what works, what doesn't work, and talking with someone who had this willingness to kind of push boundaries. And so one of the things I would say about Aaron is he has a defined ethical compass, which always means that when you ask him about something, he's willing to talk about it in a thoughtful and meaningful way. But he's also willing to push boundaries in terms of how do we interact with people? How do we connect with people? How do we develop relationships? How do we interact with our students in an online format? And having a colleague like that is a really rich experience because it helps you navigate and push those boundaries for yourself so that we identify how we have those relationships. And he has this wealth of experience in terms of working in human services, working in this field that lends itself to the insights he gives to students in class. But not only that, he's always willing to research and be thoughtful about, are we reflecting what's currently going on in the field? Are we looking at what's going to be most meaningful for outcomes for our students? And having conversations and having a colleague like that is really a great experience in terms of how do you create the best learning experience and learning environment for the students that you support. I really enjoy having Aaron as a colleague. I'm also value very much having him as a friend. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Aaron Mertes.
You better be careful. I might hug you after that. Even my own mom doesn't say that many nice things about me in one place. Okay, so how many people have been to other presentations before and heard a little bit about resilience? Like everybody here. Okay, what are the things you think of when you think of resilience? Can someone just say one out loud, like one word? Bouncing back, okay. Adaptability. Did you see my slides in advance? Okay, adaptability. Perseverance, okay. So as I was thinking about what this is going to be about, I came up with this attractive title, but we're really going to talk about, throughout this whole hour, we're going to try and understand what I understand as the definition of resilience and what that means. So we're going to go through, well, let me say one more thing. Resilience means that throughout our entire lifespan, we build this strength, this ability to bounce back. And we develop that and we grow that over time, right? So I said, well, let's go through a few of these developmental stages, that kind of thing, just to get some groundwork. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the thing that I talk about most, which, since I have a laser pointer, I'm going to use it. We're going to talk about the word maturity. And in the context of growth, what does that mean? Okay? Ultimately, we want to get to the end and understand a little bit more about resilience, and I'll give you a guide, and there'll be some tips as far as what resilience actually means and how we make more of it in our lives. That's kind of the idea. How many people have heard these kind of sayings? As you get it figured out, life changes, right? How many people think you can figure something out and just use that for the rest of your life, that one skill? No, a whole bunch of head shakes. I have a 5-year-old son, and I think, well, as soon as I understand how to, discipline and encourage and make him stronger, then he comes and does something new and different, like uses different words, and I'm like, oh, I just can't keep up with this kid, right? I want him to grow into a resilient child, somebody who can grow up and be strong and capable and adaptable and all that kind of stuff. So this idea of growing up, we use these phrases like act your age, or you're so immature. But what do we mean by maturing? Because we're going to walk through some of these scenarios and talk about childhood development, and vocational development. I'll explain what that means in a little bit. But then we get to this adult age and we say, I would like to be a mature person. I'd like to be more adaptable. But how we do that gets a little fuzzier because we don't have as much guidance on what that is. So I want to try and tease that apart a little bit as we go. Excuse me. So what would it mean to experience change without it going badly, right? We all have these situations in life where we think, that didn't go so well. That one hurt a little bit. If I was more resilient, this wouldn't feel so bad, right? Like, some people transition into adulthood successfully, right? Does anybody know anybody who's become a successful adult? Anybody sitting next to somebody who is pretty successful? Yeah, you two right there. That's exactly. But we still experience things like heartbreak and we make mistakes, right? So it's all that bad stuff is not necessarily all that bad. And yet, sometimes it is, right? So how do we piece out the hard stuff from the easy stuff, or the bad stuff from the good stuff? That's what we're going to talk about a little bit. Some transition into retirement really, really well. They know what they're going to do after they stop working, and we're going to tease that one out a little bit too. But some get lonely, some get depressed, some experience confusion about what I'm going to do after I'm done working. So I'll explain that one a little bit more too. Do we have to have all of the next stage? If we go through all these developmental stages, are we supposed to have it all figured out? Probably not. It's all going to be new to us, right? So how do we make all of that newness not so hard to experience? That's being resilient can make that a little easier, right? And we're going to talk a lot about this idea of suffering. If we're going to suffer and things are going to be hard as we grow through all those stages, how do we do it well enough to make it through? When we say, like, some people just get older and they seem to thrive, but yet they still experience the same hardship that everybody else does. So how do they do it and other people don't, right? There's some key in this idea of resilience that'll help us understand, why do some people have it easier than other people? That's kind of what we're going for here. Okay, so we're going to go through these relatively quickly. There's a lot of stuff on the screen here, and if I am as good of a teacher as she leads you to believe that I am, I'm not going to read off the screen, and I wouldn't have even put this many words on the screen to begin with, so you be the judge. But has anybody heard of Piaget? Psych 101, most of us hear of Piaget, right? From the beginning of our birth to the first 2 years, we learn a bunch of stuff, right? Like, one of them is this idea of object permanence. That means that if I have this ball, someone's holding a ball in front of me and I just want that ball. I love that ball. It's like the best ball. And you put it behind a little wall, like out loud, put it behind a little wall, and what does the kid do? It's like, where's my ball? The ball is gone, right? You bring it back out and he's like, oh, there's a ball again. But as that kid learns that thing, he realizes that ball's not really gone. It's just behind the thing. So I don't have to worry too much. And that builds a little bit of strength, a little capacity to deal with missing balls. Or mom walks into the next room, mom is gone. Mom comes back, and I learn over time that mom is still going to be there. She's just not here now, right? That idea of things going away and coming back will come back to us in a second here. The interesting thing about this one, and we've learned a lot since Piaget did most of his work, but the interesting thing is it's after 12 years, it's kind of it, according to him. We know more than that now, but according to him is you get to 12 years old and then you do all the rest of the stuff. You just think abstractly for the rest of your life, which makes sense for some of us, right? We just get more and more abstract as we grow. But then a few people added some other ideas to that, and so I want to talk about what happens during adulthood. What happens after that 12-year-old mark? This is even worse, sorry. I'm going to read some of this for you. How many people have heard of Erik Erikson? He said, he added to this discussion, it was not just cognitive development, like the things our brain do to process. He said there's something about our psychology and our sociology or psychosocial development. So the way we think inside and the way we think about other people. The yellow line across the top on the far left, the stage says infancy, 0 to 18 months. And then one of the columns down the middle, it's asking key questions to be answered during that period. So between 0 and 18 months, we ask, is my world safe? Is it safe? When mom is not there and she goes into the next room, I probably don't feel like it's that safe, right? I'm cold, I'm hungry, I want milk. Somebody take care of this for me, help me, you know? But then when mom keeps coming back, we start to learn that she keeps returning. And all of a sudden I'm like, okay, it's okay. There's a whole bunch of questions through here, the different developmental ages. Like, I'll just pick out a couple here just to talk about them a little bit. From preschool, from ages 3 to 5, this is what color is that? Beige? Mauve? I don't know what color that is, but like purplish, whatever. The question is, am I good or am I bad? Am I a good kid or a bad kid? Right? Down a little bit further, when I get to adolescence, age 12 to 18, who am I and where am I going? These are big questions, right? And as we're asking these questions, throughout our life, we're getting all kinds of feedback and having all kinds of experiences. Am I a good kid? Well, I didn't get picked for the football team, so maybe I'm not such a good kid. But then again, you learn that next time you do get picked and you work this stuff out. Young adulthood, from the ages 19 to 40, am I loved and wanted? That's a big question, right? And how many people, I'm not going to ask that. I was going to say, how many people feel loved and wanted all the time? But I think the answer is probably sometimes we just don't feel loved and wanted, right? But going back to the whole point of this talk and this whole lecture series actually is, if we're resilient enough, we somehow know we're still loved and wanted even when we're not feeling it. Does that make sense? So that's what we're really going to kind of get into, is like, how does that work? How does that happen? And more importantly, how do we do that? How do I then train myself to know that I'm loved and wanted even when I maybe don't feel it? This one is interesting too, middle adulthood. Will I provide something of real value? What does that mean? Will I make children that are valuable, that do good things, that help the world, that kind of stuff? And one of them that I think is kind of personally interesting to me is my job. Will I do things that other people find valuable in the way that we relate through our work? So does anybody, I love asking this question because nobody raises their hands, but does anybody know what a rehabilitation counselor is? You are one, so that counts. And you're going to be one maybe, so that counts. This is my specialty. Not only do I teach in the counseling program, but I am a rehabilitation counselor, which means people with different disabilities learning, figuring out how to work and to have a job. So like, basic scenario is somebody who gets injured on the job and has to go find a new job. We're not going to talk about that specifically, but this idea of career and how we identify with it is going to be important to how we build resilience. And you'll see why in just a little bit. This is a really busy picture, but I'm going to explain just a little bit about it. So when we're building the kind of person that we are as workers, right over here, we have this stage from our birth to age 14, we're growing up. And what does that have to do with our working life? Well, we grow up and we learn things like our muscles grow, so we can turn wrenches. And we learn manners, so we can get along with employees, our coworkers or whatever. And then from 15 to 24, up here, we have an exploration stage. Has anybody ever said, I want to be a firefighter when I grow up? Or, what do you guys, ballerinas? What else is there? Astronauts, basketball players, movie stars. Yeah, I told my 4th grade teacher when I was in elementary school that I was going to be a baseball player, and he's like, oh, what team do you want to play for? And I was like, I don't know any teams, I just want to play baseball. What are you talking about? Like, I had no idea. But the whole point is that we spend a little part of our childhood just trying to figure it out, using our imaginations. We can be anything we want to be, right? And we're answering questions like these ones. Who am I and where am I going in adolescence? Right, so these kind of have some overlap. Not only am I building my identity as just a human being within my family and sort of this emotional stuff, but I'm also thinking, how can I contribute and what kind of person am I? And this idea of building identity, we'll get to this in just a little bit. Then we spend a bunch of our time from ages 25 to 44, according to this guy, Donald Super. I didn't say his name, but that's his name. We're establishing ourselves in our careers. We've gone through this exploration. We've been through high school. Maybe we go to college. Maybe we start as an electrician or something like that. And we found our job, and then we're establishing ourselves. Maybe we're climbing up to our highest level of capacity, whatever, climbing a corporate ladder or whatever. Or maybe we know what we want to do and we're at our peak performance, but we have to find the right job that we can be sustained in, that's really happy and pleasant and values us and that kind of stuff. And then for a long time, we're just maintaining from 45-ish or whatever till retirement. We're just sort of maintaining. And all of these stages come with some sort of transition and their own challenges, right? And then this decline stage, one of the things that's relevant and I think kind of interesting about this is that what we're doing here is we're trying to figure out these big questions. Who am I? And how do I contribute? What's my value? Right? Just because this says decline, and that word has kind of like a negative connotation, does that mean your value declines? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe it just changes, right? And we have to figure out, at these times when it seems like I don't know if I have any value, well, but it's there, but where is it? And if I feel like it's not there, it's hard to cope with that stuff. That's when some resilience to say, just for sake of example, I'm a farmer. I found out I was a farmer here. Maybe I knew it here because my whole family's been farmers. It didn't take me long to establish myself because I work on the farm, like our farm, and then I've done it for how many years. And now, even though I'm not farming anymore, I still love on the farm, right? And those people have a strong sense of who they are and how they work, and they don't seem to struggle in retirement because they're on the farm. That's what they do, right? Is this making sense? Following along? Okay. With all these models and this kind of stuff, we're just going to kind of explain them briefly, cover them, but we don't need to put all the pieces together. We're going to do that in just a little bit. So if you just kind of hang tight, if you're sitting there confused, we'll get to the good stuff here in a second. Well, this is all good stuff, really, but you know what I mean. Has anybody ever heard of Kohlberg's theory of moral development? There's something to be said about that person who is resilient has a sense of guiding moral or guiding value. Something like that, right? So I thought this is worthy of including. If you have something like, if you reach this peak stage of step 6, individual principle of conscience, does it seem like the resilient person would have a good sense of conscience? Like they could help make moral decisions when the time comes and difficult things happen? So it's worth kind of putting this stuff in there. My son, he sometimes obeys the rules and does the things just because he doesn't want to be punished. Doesn't know why, doesn't care. He just says, I don't want to be in trouble. Trouble sucks. I don't want to do that. So he says, I'll follow the rules. But then as we grow up a little bit, we say this idea of naive hedonism, or it doesn't feel good to be in trouble. So we build this kind of reward system. And this part is going to come into play here in just a little bit. We have good experiences and bad experiences that helps us grow, and we learn from those, and then we make better decisions, right? We adapt. That's kind of the idea. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of this in great detail, but the idea is there's something moral going on here, something that if we can figure out how to make better moral decisions, then we can be more resilient or cope with difficult stuff. Okay. So, this is where we're going to get into the good stuff, I think. Because I'm a teacher, I have to talk about learning. It's just a prerequisite of any kind of lecture, I think. And you guys tell me if this checks out, too. If you're like, no, that doesn't make any sense, then just throw your tomatoes or make noise or something. Successful development involves learning. Does this follow? Okay, we have to learn things in order to develop successfully, like that ball is not going to be totally gone, right? Or mom is going to come back in the room, something like that. This is where Sepp cheated, I think. Learning requires adaptation. I have some new knowledge that I have to see if it checks out and if it fits with the old knowledge, okay? That adaptation requires trial and error, and resilience then is coping with failed trial and error attempts. So hard stuff is going to happen, right? We still suffer, but we figure out how to cope with that stuff appropriately. So we're growing, things are changing, and it's hard, but if we can cope with that hard stuff well enough, we'll make it through. Does that seem to make at least a little bit of sense so far? So this idea of maturity is, as we build maturity, the people that tend to be more resilient are better at coping when they experience difficult stuff. They have bad experiences, but you can experience it without responding poorly. And what we want to then try and get to is, how do we then respond in a not poorly way, right? Because resilience means we do this well. We figured out how to respond better or something. So what does better look like? And then you can forget that I put that on there, because I think we'll just get to that later in a second. But the idea is that we don't suffer alone. That's the whole point. We cope together. Okay. Maturity then, if we're trying to build this idea of resilience, means it requires some kind of understanding of the positive states within us, right? Because if we get to have a bad experience, it doesn't feel good, just like, the kid thinks the ball is gone, my son gets in trouble, he's having all these like uncomfortable feelings. It would be really ideal if we could get back to the good stuff. Here I'm calling it joy. Does anybody else have another term for this? Peace, harmony, communion, oneness, atonement, any other like peak states, self-actualization. There's a big one. Any of you guys remember that one? So there's we can call it whatever we want. I'm just going to use this word joy. But ultimately, like when I have bad experiences and things that don't feel good, if I could somehow say, I'm going to sit with this for a while, but as soon as I can get back to the good stuff, where I feel better, and I'm in better relationships, and people aren't mad anymore, and I'm not crying or throwing fits or anything like that we go through all through our lifespan, if I can get back to that stuff, that would be ideal, okay? Sometimes that means we have to be kind of intentional about it, to return to that space. And so we'll get to how that works in a sec too. So here's the argument. This is where I really start to see if this checks out with you guys. Maturity requires stable core identity. Remember when we talked about that farmer? Could put in rancher, business person, doesn't really matter what the job is. If he has a hardship at work, like he gets fired, but he says, I'm still a farmer. I still am a business person. I still have this identity, and I can go be that thing again somewhere else. If somebody's a little bit more confused about that and doesn't really have a strong vocational identity, or they don't have a strong sense of self, they might have a harder time coping. Does that seem to check out with you guys? That makes sense? Intuitively, at least? So a stable core identity, and this is what we do in counseling, is, do you know who you are? I know who I am in the midst of difficulty. I'm this kind of person, and this is how I react. Even when we don't always feel like it. Right? Has anybody ever had a choice finger pointed at them while you're driving? Or somebody cuts you off and you're like, I'm mad. I don't like that, and I want to send a choice finger back to them. Nobody does that, right? Chuckles, I get it. But sometimes we say, I don't want to be this angry person. I don't like the way this feels, but I'm going through this situation, and I want to be resilient enough to be the kind of person that I know I am, even when it's really hard. Okay? The other thing is that another thing that can really help us through the hard times as things are changing and as we're growing, and we might have doubts about who we are, or we're dealing with any of those big existential questions that Erickson talks about, we can say, I know who my people are in the midst of difficulty. Does anybody have anybody that they kind of lean on during the hard times? We know our families, right? We know our friends. And the stronger we are with our people, the stronger our identity with them and how much we know we can lean on them, the more likely we are to be resilient. That's probably pretty intuitive for most of us, right? If we have good people around us, we can deal with the hard stuff. We can cope through the difficult situations. No matter what change happens, we can lose our jobs, we can lose our family members, we can do all kinds of difficult things. But if I know the kind of person that I want to be, I know what it's like to be the good part of me, and I know how to get back there intentionally. It's okay to cope with this stuff, it's okay to struggle, but if I know I can get back to it, that feels like being more resilient. Does that Seem to make sense to you guys? Okay. So we're going to play with this idea for a little bit here. I know who I am, and I know who my people are. I'm taking a lot of these ideas, by the way, from these two guys, Marcus Warner and Jim Wilder. They kind of say this a little bit in a more eloquent way than I do. But I'm going to read this kind of slow just to make sure it kind of sinks in with us. Maturity develops as we grow a relational sense, remember that my people stuff, a relational sense of self that stays the same no matter what emotions we face. Okay, so we're going through all these changes, all this hard stuff is happening throughout life at all these stages. But if I can say, I'm going to stay in relationship with myself because I know who I am and the person that I want to be, and stay in relationship with my people, and we'll talk about why that's so hard in a second, but if I can do that, then I kind of grow and I get mature. And I can be a better adult, and I can be more resilient. I can build more capacity. Okay. Now we're going to do a little science. And I have to put down my thing for a second. I think the brain craves the fuel of joy, or peace, or harmony, or whatever you want to call it, serotonin, dopamine, all that kind of stuff, right? It's our reward system. We trial and error all this stuff, and we get rewards. We fail, we screw up, we sometimes do it right, all that. We're just trying to live life, learning in all these different situations. And it thrives on relational attachment to people. We've been toying with this idea of like social relationships. How many people have heard of attachment theory? Emotional bonding with other people. People are really important, right? So our brain really wants that kind of stuff. I'm going to pause on that one for just a second. Let's see, how do I ask this question? What other things does our brain crave that might be harder than attachment? In other words, let me say this a different way. If we have a conflict with somebody, does that happen in life? No, not at all. Does it happen just at certain parts of life? No way. It's like a theme all the way through life. And that's part of the change, right? Our spouses change, our friends change, people change in our churches and schools and all that kind of stuff, right? And yet, if we crave this sense of harmony, why is it so hard to get to? What kind of things do we put in place sometimes instead that keeps us from this place of resilience? Does anybody think of something that we do to cope? Not you necessarily, but just anybody? Social media, work, anything that increases dopamine in our brains, alcohol, excessive work. Social media is a bad one, right? When you're flicking through Twitter, you're doom scrolling on Twitter and you're like, oh man, there's nothing better than this feeling right now, even though we probably should be doing other things, right? Drugs, alcohol, sex, shopping, gambling, you name it. There's all kinds of things that give us that experience of euphoria. And yet, the most sustainable thing that we need to build core identity and core social or strong social relationships is more social relationships and more understanding of ourselves. And when we do these other things, they take away from that experience, right? Does that mean all that stuff is bad? Is social media bad? No, not necessarily. Is alcohol bad? No, not necessarily. It serves a really important function. It helps us cope with life, and that's kind of an okay thing. But we just have to understand its place, okay? But let's just assume that we're saying the brain really requires this feeling of attachment. We'll use that word for a minute. Do you guys buy this, by the way? You're following along at least? You wait till the end and be like, nah, you're full of garbage, I think. But for now, I'll just sit patiently and be respectful. Okay. Here's something that we know about brain functioning. The brain sits like this. You have a spinal cord and you have the brain. And the first part to grow in a child is not its logic centers, right? How many people come out of the womb doing math? Right? All these, hopefully nobody, all these executive functions that we have, we call those because they're on the top of our brain and they're kind of the last to develop. And they also happen to be the slowest parts of our brain. So when sensory experience goes up and down the spinal cord, it gets into these emotional centers first. And the attachment stuff happens fast. It happens really fast, right? before we even know it. I'll explain that one by a little example, but let's go to the next one first. How many people have heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response? The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, it's part of that Psych 101 stuff. Have you had the experience where you're like walking around, like, I don't know, you walk past a hallway and all of a sudden you see something out of the corner of your eye and you kind of jump a little bit, and there's a split second before you actually recognize what it is. You just remembered that you like hung a Halloween spider and it's not actually dangerous, but you don't really know what it is until you, it takes a second to register a little bit. That's because we have this stuff going on that's way below our level of conscious awareness, right? It's just like happening inside of us, and it's keeping us safe. That's the whole purpose of the fight, flight, or freeze system, is to keep us safe. And I'm just going to pause for a second and bring us back to all those big questions that Erik Erikson was asking of, am I safe? Am I loved? Am I cared for? Do I have purpose? Do I have value? All that kind of stuff. I would venture a guess that some of that stuff is happening below our level of conscious awareness too. Okay? So then we have this thing that we call attunement, or emotional synchrony. We are, when we talk about having a strong core identity and a strong social identity, it's going to require some attunement with other people to connect, right? And we all know that, especially in the midst of conflict, that stuff doesn't always happen automatically. Sometimes it takes a little bit of work. Anybody married here? Does your perfect relationship just happen automatically all the time? No, right? That sounds ridiculous. The one couple that's sitting next to each other that I can see, they're like, yeah, we get it. If my wife was here, she'd be like, no, of course not, right? It takes some work. But it happens a little bit slower than those immediate reactions, but we can kind of attune and synchronize with each other over time, right? And we can get good at that. And by the way, if you are sort of in sync with your partner, do you tend to be more resilient in the midst of conflict? Probably, right? And then the slowest part of our brain, the part that's way on the top in the front, where it's doing all the math calculations and making logical decisions and really trying hard, the stuff that, frankly, we don't always get right when these other things are not happening well. So if our brain is just on fire because we're in fight, flight, or freeze mode, and we're just like, I got to get away from this bad experience, do we make logical decisions at that time? Do we make mature decisions at that time? Probably not, right? So part of this building resilience is figuring out, how do we then train our brains to want to crave the things that are going to be good for them? Does that make sense? Okay. So now, I'm going to check the time really quick. So now we get to what does this actually look like? So I'm just going to get the lay of the land again. This presentation is part of a resilience series, but it's about changes that continue to happen throughout life, that if we can build capacity, build adaptiveness or adaptability, if we can do that, then we can gain resilience and be better at coping with the challenges of life. Number one, if we can have hard things in which we're inevitably going to suffer through, but we can remain relational with other people. In other words, we don't fight, flight, freeze in the midst of conflict with people. I don't perceive people as dangerous. That guy who uses the choice finger, I really want to fight with that guy. Or be like, let him go, I just got to get away from this, right? Or someone sends me a challenging email and I'm like, I'm going to avoid that person as long as I possibly can, at least for the rest of the day. But that's not going to really solve any problems, right? It's not going to bring us into some repaired relationship that we can then figure out the problem that we had to begin with, right? So if I can somehow say, I know who I am, and I know who my people are, and because Paula's here, I'll just use her because we work together. If I know that even when I'm having a hard time, that she's one of my people, and I can go to her and talk to her about hard stuff, that seems like a recipe for resilience, right? We're going to get through whatever it is. Acting like yourself. This one sometimes can be a little tricky for people to understand what that means. Think of think of the way that you would choose to respond to something difficult versus the kind of response that you sometimes give. Because most of us, remember that like moral, the moral model we were talking about earlier, Kohlberg's stages of moral development? At the top is this idea of conscience. A lot of us have a gut sense of the kind of person that I want to be. This is the person that I am. And the better we get at learning to cope with difficult things and the more resilient we get, the more we sort of enact the kind of person that we really are at our core. If we fuel our brain with all the good stuff and we can make the best decisions possible, which we don't always, but if we can do that, that's the kind of person that I am. And if I can get back to that in the midst of difficulty, that would be a great thing. Seems like it anyway. This idea of returning to joy, again, love, peace, harmony, all those words. If I can get back to that intentionally, that would be ideal. Has anybody ever gotten really good at this and said, I'm really frustrated, so I'm going to take a little break. And I'm going to go back, take my break, deal with this stuff, and then I'll come back. It'd be great if you just didn't get frustrated, right? If you could just instantly say, this is not something that's going to get me emotionally heightened, or it's not going to be difficult. And yet, we can't expect that for our entire lives. We're going to lose somebody that we care about, and we're going to get really sad. And sadness is not one of those feelings that we tend to like. But it's okay to have it. We just want to get back out of it. Because when we're talking about the grand scheme of life situations, those are hard ones, right? And some of us really spend a lot of time in there. But we have to come out of it. And if we don't, we're going to stay sad for a long time. So if I can say, I'm not always a sad person. I really want to be a happy person. So how can I then encourage the decisions that I make and train myself and my brain to get back to those states? That's what we're talking about here. Is this making sense? Okay, I can move on then? All right. And then enduring hardship, well, I think this doesn't mean that we don't suffer. Is there anybody here that believes that we should just be happy all the time? No? Is there anybody here that likes to have a hard time and likes to suffer? No. When we get to the suffering stuff, we get to the change and we get to these big transition periods like, we're going into retirement and I'm scared that I won't know what to do with myself when all my work buddies aren't around. And, my kid's going off to college. I'm scared that he's going to get in trouble or something bad's going to happen. And yet we know we have to do it, right? And sometimes when we are scared, we have that fight, flight, or freeze response. And then we either fight against something of all the RAs that come tell him who he's supposed to be. And we're like, I got to protect him, right? Which is not helpful. Or we just sort of say, okay, I got to let him go, and then we don't give enough support as much as we would like to. We know we have to endure hardship. And yet we also let ourselves kind of slide into this fight mode sometimes, or the flight mode sometimes. And the idea is how do we welcome the hardship and not lose this sense of who we are in the moment? I'm the kind of person that can take this. I have the capacity to handle this difficult thing. I am resilient. That's kind of what we're trying to shoot for here. Okay. These are 4 habits of mature people. But when we think of resiliency, we don't think of just individuals, right? We also think of communities. So what is oh, that looks bad. I'm going to read this for you because that did not look like that 45 minutes ago. Communities, which could mean families, it could mean workplaces, it could mean cities, it could mean countries, doesn't really matter. It's just groups of people. Because when we say things like, I know who my people might be MSUB colleagues. It might be the people that live in my house. Could be Americans, whatever it is. In order to build resilient communities, one of the things we have to do is prioritize group identity. And what you can't see here behind all the words is that it says we can have results, but we must achieve them together. How many people have worked at a place that says, we have a job to do and you have to perform? Right? That's kind of an important thing. I'm a teacher. I have to be able to teach. I have to perform the job of teaching, right? But it also means that there are going to be times when I can't teach. And if, we'll just say Paula's my boss. She's not really my boss because she tells me that all the time. But she says, I'm your boss. If you can't teach, you're out of here. Right? Then they have to spend time hiring somebody else, and they're going to have a hard time attracting good staff because it's going to be kind of a hostile environment, right? Fortunately, we don't have that. But prioritizing group identity means that sometimes somebody's going to have a hard time. Somebody's going to get pregnant and go on medical leave. Somebody's going to get sick. Somebody's going to have bad days, right? All that stuff. And if we say, but we want to stick together, we want to support each other, do you think that's a more resilient environment, or one that focuses just on performance and outcomes? Right? We can still expect outcomes. We can still want people to perform their best, but if we don't have this sense of togetherness, it's harder, much harder. Promoting belonging. In my head, when I think of what is it like to feel belonging, it's the kind of place that you don't just go because you have to, because they give you a paycheck, and you really wouldn't go there, and you don't really like anybody that you're around, but you kind of have to go because you got to pay for bills, right? But if there's a place where I feel like I'm important, I have purpose, and I belong, and people value me there, I choose to go to those places. It starts to become fun, and it's easy. And when things are fun and easy, am I more likely to handle hardship? Probably, right? When bad things happen, when the technology fails, and when I don't know, somebody gets sick. There's all kinds of scenarios that are not ideal, right? But when we feel like we're in this together, we can then help pick that person up, or we can say, go take your break, we'll take care of it. We support each other. Builds resilience within the community to have this sense of belonging. Is that an easy thing to nurture? It's hard, I think. I guess I'm the only one. I think it's hard. You guys find it easier. You can teach me how to do it later. No, I'm just kidding. Practicing authentic appreciation. I think we all know this, but yet it's still a really hard thing to practice. Anybody ever, you see this on movies where there's like, Aaron, you've been doing a great job. I'm going to give you the employee parking spot for 30 days, and just really to show you how much I care. Does that sound like authentic? No. But if somebody comes in and says, you know, the thing that you said in that meeting, I just want to tell you that it's important, and I appreciate it. That sounds like an authentic thing, right? Or even just the littlest thing of like looking somebody in the eye instead of walking past them and just giving, you know, those kind of things. This seem really cheesy. Yeah, good job, buddy. You know, they don't work. Would you be really excited to go see that guy next time when you walk by him in the hallway? No, not really, right? And the whole idea is that if you have this sense of that person's with me, they actually appreciate me. Remember the Erickson stages again, the big questions? I feel loved, I feel valued, I feel safe, I can make it through this. Our community is resilient because people are authentic with each other and they care. That's the idea here. And this one is, the last one here is kind of controversial, I think, maybe, but there's another thing on the next slide that'll maybe make a little bit more sense. But the idea of protecting the weak. If you have a community that blames people who struggle, or in other words, fight with them, if you leave them out because they can't make it, they're not producing results, they're not as fast and strong as everybody else, or in other words, you flight from them, sort of ignore them, or you just push people away, then it doesn't really make anybody stronger. The reason this one's hard is because like if you just sort of like, I don't know, to use a lack of a better phrase, if you kind of cut the fat, then you get rid of the weak link and everybody else does better. But where does that weak link go? Well, if they're part of your company and you fire the people who can't perform, they go across the street to the next company, and then all of a sudden there's still two companies in your community, and that person's still part of your community, but now you have a division. And now you have one company that might be a little bit stronger, but you have a whole profession or a community of, I don't know, schools or businesses or whatever, where there's going to be hardship. And if something happens in the entire economy of that city, and those two companies maybe need to lean on each other, it's going to be a lot harder, right? It's bad blood. So if we don't get in the habit of looking at the people who are having a harder time and saying, how can we support them? Even though they make me frustrated and they make me angry and I really have a hard time with them and they're difficult, but I can still look at them and say, how can I make them better? How can I help them through this hard time? They may still not stay at the company. They might still not be the greatest family member, and you might still have a hard time with them. But nevertheless, if we don't look at them and say, they're part of my circle somehow, and they still kind of matter, then the communities just have a harder time. And I'm not going to bring up politics, kind of I am, but I'm not going to talk about politics. But there's lots of division right now. And I would say that it makes us have a little bit harder time leaning on our neighbors and having strong, resilient communities that can handle difficult things when there's a lot of division and conflict and anger and frustration and all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, we can look at things like natural disasters. When big, bad things happen to a whole bunch of people, all of a sudden we stop, we kind of put all that hard stuff aside, all of our differences and all that kind of stuff, and we say, no, we together can be resilient. Even though we may not like each other on other days, when there's no hurricanes, we're enemies, but all of a sudden there's this big hard thing and now we're friends again. You know, stuff like that says we change our attitude when sometimes big, challenging, changing transitions, all this stuff, it happens, and then we can say, oh, actually, you know, our group identity is a little bit stronger than we thought. And we actually kind of do belong to each other. And we have those moments that demonstrate this to us, but it's hard to hang on to them when we're not in the midst of hardship. Remember all that stuff we just said about like welcoming hardship? We may not like it, but when it happens, we're actually a little better off than we think we are most of the time. Does that make sense? Okay. And then lastly, I'm going to read this sentence a little bit slow because there's a lot packed in here, and this kind of brings it all together. Again, we've looked at all these developmental models, these developmental stages, and one of the things that we spent a little bit more time on is how do we develop our stronger core sense of self and a stronger relational identity with other people, giving you some skills to think about in order to make that happen. And ideally, if those happen, if you buy into this stuff, if you can do those things, then it builds resilience in communities and in ourselves. But if we develop that stable identity, we know who we are, we know how we act in the midst of hardship, and if we can do that in a socially relational way, in other words, we can understand who we are, our best selves, in relation to other people around us, not alone, but together. If we can do that, and we can harness this, when bad stuff happens, I can get back to my best self. And I might even lean on Paula to do it. I might even lean on Sep to do it, or Darlene, or anybody else. If we have that kind of strength, if we can do that, we live full, purposeful lives with other people. But in order to live that purposeful life and to weather the storms of all these big transitional periods and all these changes, whether you're young or you're old or whatever, we can't do it alone, and we have to build a strong sense of self. I kind of already said the second line there, our work gives us community and purpose. I shouldn't skip over that so fast, though. How important our working lives are, it's kind of a big deal, because we spend a lot of time at work, right? And sometimes we say, I want to have family values, and I want to nurture the people that are around me, and I want to love them, and it's so great. And if anybody tells me that I'm part of the Taco Bell family, I just want to vomit, right? Because it doesn't seem authentic or genuine. And yet, we spent a whole bunch of time at work. And good leaders, I would argue, of companies, especially big ones, they try and build this by calling their people teams or families or that kind of stuff, because they recognize there's something about this belonging and about this like building cohesiveness that's really important and valuable. And work is super important, but it's also very different. And it can't provide all the same things that families can. But that's a hard one. That's one that I don't think we're still working on figuring out how to build strong identity at work and how to cope with work relationships, because they're just harder. That part about protecting the weak that I just said, that I would kind of foreshadow a little bit, I think that the more that we get resilient, the more that we mature and grow, the more our scope of who we care about expands a little bit. In other words, when I'm a kid, kids, they don't care about anything except themselves, right? What do babies want? Milk? Warmth? Does mom matter? No, mom's there to provide for me. And they get older and they're like, 3 years old or whatever, and they're like, I want, only I matter, right? Maybe mom matters a little bit, dad matters, kind of whatever, but it's mostly about me. And you get older and you see where this is going. You expand the people you care about to your friends, and then to your business company or your larger friend group, and then maybe the in-laws, and you start to care about maybe like the community you live in at some point as you're growing, and then maybe about like the state kind of matters a little bit more, and your country identity, and then maybe at some point in there, maybe you realize that if I start throwing stuff into the waterway, it's going to go affect the people downstream, and then it's going to go up in the sky, and all of a sudden the whole world is kind of affected by my decisions. So I think there's something about, as we grow, we build this expanding sense of who matters. All this stuff about belonging and community and all that kind of stuff, the more we get strong, the more we have the capacity to care for more people and more things. It's kind of the idea with that one. And the important thing is we just don't lose sight of all this in the midst of hardship. So once you get the hang of stuff, it changes, yes. But resilience then is the ability to go through all the hard stuff and then do these things to get back to, I'm back together with my people, I remain relational, I know who I am, I know who they are, and we can do this kind of stuff together. So, does that make sense? And then when I downloaded the template for PowerPoint, they put in this Walt Disney quote, and I just didn't get rid of it because I thought it was funny. And it was relevant. It's not an accident that somebody put this at the end, but the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing, of course. The hard thing is, though, is that if I say, okay, how can I get back to a peaceful place the next time that guy sticks up his finger when I drive a Prius, so I get this a lot in Montana. People are like, I learned this is called coal rolling. When someone drives by you, hits the gas and it blows out black smoke. This happens. And when that happens, I'm like, I feel discriminated, or like they're picking on me. I don't really get mad at people that way, but I do. Sometimes I'm like, and I get kind of pouty about it. But then if I actually can apply this kind of stuff and say, but my people don't react that way. I want to be a part of those kind of people that do this differently. And so we say, that guy maybe had a hard day. Whatever his thing is, I don't know. He doesn't like me. Fine. Whatever. But I'm not going to lose my sense of who I am in the midst of all that stuff. So if we can practice this, we build resilience. That's kind of the idea. That's all I got. Do we do questions, or do we just say goodbye? And does anybody have any questions? Or things that you think, that just didn't make sense. What's that all about? Or I don't like that part. What does that mean? Or anything? If not, there's lemon bars out there. Okay. Well, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.